Hey everybody, John Mark here. Welcome to Mark My Words, and welcome to one of the most important videos I will ever make. Parasite-Proof Governance, Intro to Propertarianism. Today I'm going to explain to you key benefits and features of propertarianism, which is, as I call it, the iPhone of right-wing thinking, because it builds on all the things that made Western civilization great and fixes some of the mistakes we've been making, which have been allowing parasites to swarm all over us, while extending the advantages that Western civilization has had, which has allowed us to drag half of humanity out of ignorance, poverty, and disease and become the most dominant and wealthy civilization in the history of the world. Propertarianism is the long-term solution for the right wing, and I'm going to explain the basics of it to you today, and I'm really excited about that. This video is going to be a little bit longer than most of my videos because there's a good amount of information to cover, but it is worth your time because this is our long-term solution. Just a couple of notes before I jump in. There are links in the description to helpful resources if you want to dive more into propertarianism, so check those out. There's also a meme stash. If you're excited about propertarianism like I am, we have a stash of propertarian memes that you can access just by clicking the link in the description. Everything from just fun, simple stuff to direct quotes from propertarianism, just to pique people's interest and get them to check it out. And also, of course, share this video with people because my goal is to make it a good, accessible introduction in easy to understand language. And this brings me to my opening comment number 3. Curt Doolittle is the originator of propertarianism. He knows me, he supports what I'm doing, which is I'm working to popularize it because I believe it's a fantastic solution and it's gaining a lot of traction with a lot of smart people now because it makes a ton of sense. But just don't take what I say here as necessarily the ultimate, the best explanation ever of propertarianism, so to speak. The Propertarian Institute and Curt Doolittle ultimately would be the source for that. If I find out after the fact that I have made any kind of inaccurate statement, I will fix it in the description or in a future video. And of course, this video is not a complete training course in propertarianism by any means. It's an introduction. So some of you who are intellectual types, you're really going to want to dive into it more than what I provide in my videos because there's a lot of fascinating stuff there. And others of you, many of you are just very busy with life, work, family, all of that, and you don't have the time or the inclination to really dive into the depths of it. That's great. Not everybody's going to be able to do that. So one of my goals is to make the basics understandable enough. And the basics really are not all that complicated. Even though the work that went into getting here was pretty remarkable, the basic picture of what the solution looks like, the average person who's busy with life is certainly capable of understanding the basic solutions and why they're so powerful. Another thing you should know is that propertarianism is not some fly-by-night thing. This is not some blogger that threw up a blog for a couple months and said, this is my opinion. This is a full, large-scope solution developed over many years, heavily reliant on the scientific method, applying the scientific method to understanding and solving the problems inherent in human interactions, with a full written constitution that is now basically ready to put into place. And if you look around the landscape of the right wing in the West, there is no one else offering any kind of solution that comes anywhere close to this as far as the completeness and the scope of the solution. And the fact that it's now pretty much ready to go, ready to be implemented. And just so you know a little bit about Curt Doolittle, he's very successful in the real world. He started several tech companies and sold them. He sold at least one of them to Microsoft, for example. And then when he had made his money, he spent 10 years learning how the world works and synthesizing it. And you can see the Propertarian reading list on the website. I'll put a link in the description as well. And the fact is, today we have more scientific and accurate understanding of how human beings work and why they do what they do. So now we have enough knowledge at this point in history to produce something that approaches what you could call scientific government or scientific governance. And that's what propertarianism is, as you're going to see. So Curt Doolittle has synthesized a tremendous amount of this scientific knowledge and understanding about humanity, and he began putting his ideas out there and refining them over the course of several years with an ever-growing group of very smart people that has now built up around it, and it's ready now. It's ready to be popularized, and it's going to go big because it is a great solution for our problems in the long term. I came across this a couple years ago, and when I felt like I'd really wrapped my head around the main aspects of it, I said to myself, I need to help spread this. And just so you're aware as well, I know and every proprietarian knows that there's a very low percentage chance that we would be able to implement something like this in the current system, but that's okay because there is going to be a disruption of the current system because it cannot and will not keep going the way it is. As many of you have heard me say, by far the most likely outcome of the situation we're in right now in America is civil war, and by far the most likely outcome of that is the grassroots right wing wins the civil war. And I will have videos that go into detail on all that. But the bottom line is we need to be ready with the solution because there is a very significant chance that we are going to have an opportunity to implement something better, and we cannot be caught with our pants down. We have to be ready with something better, and this is it. Proprietarianism is what we need to be ready to go with. When I talk to other people out there about what are alternate solutions, it basically comes down to, well, hopefully a strong man could rise up. Even if you get a strong man to rise up and solve your problems, that's fine, but what do you do after that? Because your strong man can be George Washington or your strong man can be Hugo Chavez. A strong man is not a stable long-term solution. Proprietarianism is a stable long-term solution, as you will see. All right, let's jump into the benefits of proprietarianism. What will proprietarianism do for you and for our people? Number one, no more banker parasitism. No more usury, no more debt slavery. We cut out the middlemen bankers. The bottom line is you can pay off your mortgage in 10 or maybe 15 years max instead of 30. Way less auto debt. No more debt slavery at the hands of middlemen bankers that are completely unnecessary. No more bankers bringing money into existence out of thin air and charging you far more interest on it than you would normally have to pay in a good money system. Number two, no more higher education parasitism on students. I'm not going to go into the detail of this solution, but you can read about it in the links that I provide. No more leftist parasitism. No more welfare state, that kind of thing. All these other leftist schemes. Now, I'll say care can be provided voluntarily by nonprofits, by smaller groups, by voluntary agreement. So it's not like we have to have a completely heartless nation or polity, but the left is not going to be able to vote themselves free stuff stolen from you and me via the government just by winning an election. Because as you'll see in proprietarianism, no parasitic legislation can be passed because of a key improvement in our system of government. So if you have no theft left, there's no left. No more leftist parasitism. Another benefit, no more corrupt politicians. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but proprietarianism has an improvement in our system of government where there's actually some flexibility in the system of government, but there's a layer of protection on top of it that does not allow parasitic legislation to be passed, which then removes the ability for politicians to be corrupt. Because why would you buy a politician if they're not able to pass parasitic legislation that benefits you at the expense of somebody else? If you can't pass parasitic legislation, there's no point in even buying politicians. You'll see how that works. Right now, our politicians are completely corrupt. They're all bought and paid for by the rich elites that don't give a flying rip about the people. All of our legislation is written by corporate lawyers. The system is completely broken. The middle class, the working class, the grassroots right, everyday white people in general, we can't get any politicians to look out for our interests when it comes to the border or anything else because all the politicians are owned by people who don't have our interests in mind. And the system is so corrupt that even when we bring in a Trump, an outsider, he's fighting against the entire system. The system is broken, folks. The system needs to change, and the system will change because it is not sustainable. It contains the seeds of its own destruction. Just like any kind of a parasite, things are great for the parasite until it kills the host. Well, the parasites are getting so close to killing the host, which is the grassroots right wing in America right now, that it's not going to last, as I'll explain in more detail in other videos. Another benefit, no more elite parasitic scams. Proprietarianism has a feature, an improvement in rule of law, that makes public figures have skin in the game when they speak publicly. They can't just lie anymore with impunity. So this, combined with the other two major improvements in rule of law that proprietarianism has, will make it so that the elites cannot run parasitic scams. It's much, much more difficult for them to get away with that kind of stuff under proprietarianism. No more leftist political movements based on lies about humanity. This is a big one. Because of the improvements in rule of law and proprietarianism, public figures will not be able to lie with impunity, as I said. So that means they're not going to be able to stand up and whip up leftist political movements by telling lies. Because you can't whip up a leftist political movement without telling big fat lies about humanity. So politicians and HR departments, for that matter, will simply not be able to go around saying stuff like, everyone is equal, or diversity is our strength, or the relative lack of success of black and brown people is all white people's fault. It's very easy to falsify these statements using the science and the data and the facts, so leftist political activism will be essentially impossible, just because public figures will not be able to lie like this with impunity. So I'll explain more about that in a minute, how it works, but the bottom line is leftist political agitation will be somewhere on the scale between virtually impossible and impossible. And again, this doesn't mean we have to have a place with no compassion for our people, but these leftist political movements that lie to people simply will not be able to operate. And as you will see, this is not just some small group of people or somebody willy-nilly deciding what can be said and what can't be said. This is very specific, scientific, empirical definitions and mechanisms in rule of law that will be adjudicating these things. Another benefit, no more affirmative action. Affirmative action is theft. I'm not going to go into that. That's fairly obvious, I think. No more anti-white propaganda or political movements that are blatantly anti-white. The modern left has basically turned into an anti-white political movement. And they do this by telling blatant lies, falsely accusing white people of being the source of all the problems of anybody that has darker skin, completely ignoring all of the great things, the amazing things that white people, especially of Western European descent, have done for the entire world, in fact. When they are not able to tell these kind of lies, they will not be able to whip up anti-white propaganda or anti-white political movements. Along with that, no more colonization of Western civilization and specifically of white people. The left will no longer be able to simply import millions of non-white people who mostly vote left, who mostly don't care about white people, and in many cases, even most cases, are antagonistic toward white people. Anybody who doesn't act in reciprocity toward the designers and builders of Western civilization is not going to be able to come into America. And of course, America as a sovereign nation, whether it's America or whether it's a grassroots right-wing nation that covers a portion or portions of America in the future, however it works out, we as a sovereign nation will be able to reject anyone we want for any reason whatsoever, obviously as a sovereign nation. And we will have specific and thorough legal language built into our rule of law, according to proprietarianism, that gives the regular people legal recourse to make sure that doesn't happen if anybody ever tries to push for it in the future. The last benefit I'll mention, no more fake news. Public figures, including news organizations, journalists, and talking heads will not be able to lie, including lying by omission. They will not be able to put out blatantly faulty information because if they do, they can be sued. The same way that Chevrolet can be sued if they put out a bunch of cars with faulty brakes that hurt people. Proprietarianism provides the solution for fake news. That's not all the benefits of proprietarianism, but that is a short list of them. Now let's start moving toward how does proprietarianism work? And in order to understand why it's so powerful, it's helpful to have at least a basic understanding of why Western civilization became so dominant in the first place. And why even to this day we're still very dominant, even despite all the parasites sucking on us as hard as they can. We've done a lot of things right, and we need to identify and understand that. And once we do that, we say, okay, let's do more of that. And anything that tries to weaken or limit or oppose our best practices is our enemy, and we reduce it and stamp it out and get rid of it. That's how we get better. So here's a short list of the civilizational best practices that made Western civilization the most wealthy, most powerful civilization in history, with a higher average quality of life for its citizens than any civilization in history, that produced the great majority of the major advancements for humanity that dragged half the world out of ignorance, poverty, and disease. What did we do right? Here's the basic list. And we could expand this further, but I'm giving you the super basics here. First of all, property rights. We could call this by different names. We could call it rule of law. We could call it sovereignty. We could call it stamping out corruption. We could call it punishing parasites, as I did in a previous video where I talked about the first rule of a great civilization is stamping out parasitism. So when I explain the improvements in rule of law that proprietarianism gives us here in a moment, you're going to notice that proprietarianism expands property rights. It takes something that we've already done really well overall and expands it to cover the areas where we have not been doing it as well as we need to. Reducing underclass size, that's another huge rule of a great civilization. I won't go too much into that, but one of the effects of propertarianism is that your low IQ people can't have more babies than your middle class people, for example, because it limits the ability of the underclass to steal money from the middle class through the mechanism of government. And third, and this is massively important, is truth. Western civilization has sought truth and told the truth better than any other civilization. We take it for granted many times if you just live in Western civilization, but no other civilization has an appreciation for and a freedom for telling the truth the way that Western civilization does. Truth-seeking and truth-telling, regardless of impact on the dominance hierarchy or the status hierarchy. In other words, you could just call it science, empiricism. So when I explain the basics of propertarianism in a moment, you will see that it expands the power of truth in our society and drastically reduces the power of lies, which will produce massive civilizational advance, just as it has in the past every time we've done that. When we latched onto the scientific method and started using the scientific method in the hard sciences to identify truth, reality, how things actually work, we got an explosion of benefit, got an explosion of medical technology, all sorts of technology. So what propertarianism does, and if you catch this, this is just so mind-boggling. What propertarianism does is it takes the scientific method and expands it over from the hard sciences into also now the realm of social interactions, the social political realm. So you'll see the basics of how that works in a second. And there will be just as much benefit from that as when we did it in the hard sciences. So you're going to see here in a second how propertarianism extends and defends each of these civilizational best practices. Right now, the parasitic left and the parasitic elites are in full-on attack mode in the process of destroying and reversing each of these civilizational best practices because they have a lot of short-term incentives to do so. Propertarianism, when implemented, will ensure that they never have the ability to build up an attack like this again. So our descendants, although they will have to be ever vigilant, will never have to fight this battle to this extent again. A quick note before I go on, some people might look at this list and say, well, Christianity needs to be on this list. That's a whole nother discussion that I'm not going to get into right now. All I will say right here is that if you're a Christian, if you read your Bible in the book of Romans, it says that the job of government is to punish evil. And that is exactly what propertarianism does. That's all I will say about that right now. All right, so here's a brief list of propertarianism's contributions, and then I'm going to get into painting a basic picture for you of how propertarianism would work. Really briefly, propertarianism's primary contributions, and again, this is not necessarily a complete list, but this is some of the main contributions that it makes. Number one, it thoroughly explains the reasons for Western civilization's unique success. Number two, it extends the scientific method, as I mentioned, from the physical realm into the social-political realm, the realm of human interactions. It gives us key improvements in rule of law. It has a governmental design feature that gives you some flexibility in your government design, but at the same time has a fail-safe that makes it so that there's no corrupt politicians. You get rid of that whole dynamic. And it has a recommendation for governance that gives you a very powerful team defense against parasitism aspect. So now I'm going to focus on the 3 improvements in rule of law and the last couple of items that you see there. And this is going to give you a good basic picture of how propertarianism would work. The first improvement in rule of law that propertarianism gives us is a full definition of property. Propertarianism's definition of property is that which an individual or group invests in and acts to defend. Now, when you think about that, you realize this is a much broader definition of property than our current rule of law has. It's a much broader definition of property than, for example, libertarianism. And this is very powerful because what it does is it extends property rights to that which human beings actually consider to be their property, even if we haven't learned to speak of it and think of it as property. So this extends property rights because it extends the definition of property to reflect reality, to reflect the reality of what human beings actually consider to be property. So before I give you a couple examples, I want to point out this definition is not something somebody just came up with. This definition is empirical. In other words, it's scientific. It's based on empirical observation of how human beings act. People act to defend what they have invested in. So the key point to get here is property is not just physical stuff. It's not just things like, say, intellectual property. Property can also be intangibles, and it can be common property that groups own, that even a whole nation of people invests in. So let me give you some examples. One form of property that we all value is a feeling of safety in our neighborhood where we live. When you live around people with a low crime rate and a low propensity for annoying or harmful behaviors, that is a form of property. If people start moving into your neighborhood that have more annoying or less trustworthy behaviors, even they don't have as much in common with you. They're very different than you. Maybe they speak a different language. Maybe instead of waving at you when you walk by, you're looking at a bunch of guys that just kind of stare at you as you drive by. Well, if that happens in your neighborhood, you have been stolen from. Something that you valued has been taken away from you. And if it happens enough, as the research and the data shows over and over and over again, people just move out of their neighborhood. Why are they moving out of their neighborhood? Why is white flight a thing? Even among white leftists that say they're so loving of diversity. The reason it happens is because people perceive that something they value has been taken from them. If you go to the grocery store near your house and there's no security guard anywhere, everything's great, people are generally trustworthy, and then over time it gets to the point where suddenly there's bars on the windows, there's 2 security guards standing outside, you have been stolen from. You went from having a safe neighborhood to having to watch your back, and this is not even to mention, of course, the costs that the store has to pay for the security guard and increased theft and all of this. What I want you to understand is that's a property violation. Another example we could give, the most valuable asset of a nation could be expressed roughly in its average IQ. The average IQ of its people is a rough indicator of the quality of the human capital of that nation. You cannot have a first world nation unless you have an average IQ of your people that gets close to 100. In America, we have an average IQ that's dropping now. It's just below 100 now, 97, 98, something like that. If you import 1 million people with an average IQ of 85 or 90, that is theft. Because the quality of life of a certain number of your citizens will go down. And it doesn't matter if there's a bunch of geniuses and doctors in there because they're not enough to make up for the costs imposed by the lower IQ people. And I'm not even saying they're all horrible people. I'm just saying overall, there's theft going on. The quality of the human capital of the nation is owned commonly by the people of that nation. And so if you allow certain groups of people in the nation with certain short-term incentives to import groups of people with a lower average IQ just because it's good for them in the short term, but it imposes costs on other people, you are allowing parasitism. So property is not just physical stuff. It's anything that people have invested in and act to defend. Now, as you can tell, our problem right now as right-wingers in America, let's just use the border as an example. We feel like we have no quality control over our border. We are being stolen from, not only with illegal immigration, which obviously allows a lot of this drug activity and seedy characters to come over because there's no filtering at all, but even legal immigration because most of these non-white people that come in vote left-wing. They get caught up into anti-white political agitation. There are costs being imposed upon us. And what is our problem? Our problem is we have no legal recourse against this because our rule of law does not consider the quality of the human capital of our nation to be a form of property. But it is property. So propertarianism extends the definition of rule of law to reflect that it is actually property. So under propertarianism, something like this could never happen. Because all that would have to happen is the regular people can say, this is imposing a cost on us, I can demonstrate it to you, and it will be nipped in the bud, according to very specific legal definitions. And as you'll see, all of these 3 improvements in rule of law work together. You can't just take one of them by yourself. I'm just explaining the first one right now. But you should get the point by now. Once your brain starts to grasp this, you start to see everything that happens in terms of property disputes. When somebody gets upset, it's because they perceive that there's a threat of parasitism or actual parasitism upon something that they value, that they consider to be property. And of course, I need to point out, stealing something or acting parasitic to acquire something doesn't count as legitimate investment in property. I can't walk into your house and steal your TV, and then when I get dragged into court, I can't use the defense of, well, I invested time and effort into stealing this TV, so it's a form of property. It's my property. No, that doesn't fly. So a welfare queen can't sit there and say, well, I invested in getting this welfare money every month by voting for a leftist politician, so you can't take that away from me because it's my property. No, you're just a parasite. So that's important to point out as well. So when we expand the definition of property to reflect reality, when we have an empirical scientific definition of property based on observation of what human beings actually consider to be their property, what happens is your rule of law does its job way better than before. So let me give you an example. We've all seen mafia movies. And of course, the mafia operates outside of rule of law because that's their whole business model. So when one group of mobsters has a dispute with another group of mobsters, say one group of mobsters gets mad and they go and they kill the son of the main mobster of the other group. And then those guys retaliate. And you've got this big retaliation cycle going on completely outside of rule of law. And there's collateral damage and people are getting shot in the street. So you have a retaliation cycle that's happening outside of rule of law. The whole point of rule of law is to stop those retaliation cycles outside of rule of law and bring them into the legal system so that all of the violence is happening only through the legal system. So it's just the police showing up and arresting people. Now, if you think about America today, there's all these retaliation cycles happening. Everybody's getting pissed. The grassroots right is at their wits' end. Why is this happening? It's because our rule of law is not doing its job sufficiently. Our rule of law is allowing all sorts of parasitism to happen outside of its purview. And because they're allowing that, when you allow parasitism, people are always going to try to retaliate however they can against parasitism. And if your rule of law system does not allow them to retaliate against it and defend against it in court, your rule of law system is leaving people no option but to retaliate outside of the system of rule of law. So that's why we're headed towards civil war, because our rule of law is not capturing all the property disputes that are happening, and it's not giving people recourse to defend against parasitism and theft of that which we value. So propertarianism's full definition of property enables a system of rule of law to capture all of this conflict that is happening outside of the rule of law system right now, and that is getting ready to explode into a civil war. Under propertarianism, this would never even happen in the first place because it wouldn't allow the parasitism to happen in the first place, because as soon as somebody tries to do that type of parasitism, the people whose property is being infringed upon have recourse in court. So the first step in stopping parasitism and building a great civilization is you have to have property rights. And your definition of property has to be full and complete and accurate and empirical and scientific so that you can capture all of the property violations that people attempt. Now, what's the second step in stopping the parasitism? Well, you have to have a way to decide all of these conflicts over what we now know how to think of as property. You have to have a rule, and propertarianism gives us that as well. This is the second improvement in rule of law that propertarianism provides. And of course, it works very closely with the first improvement, the full definition of property. Now, before I tell you what the rule is, I just want to point out you can't just have an arbitrary rule. You can't just have somebody making up a rule based on a whim. You've got to have something ideally scientific, empirical, based on observation of how human beings consistently act. And well, wouldn't you know it, propertarianism does have an empirically observed scientific rule for deciding what is parasitism and what is not, what is okay and what is not. We call this natural law of reciprocity. We also call it the anti-parasitism principle, and you see the definition on your screen. You see the rule written there on your screen. All transactions between humans and groups under propertarianism must meet that definition that you see right there. One of Western civilization's biggest secrets is because we did rule of law better than most other people, we forced more of the transactions in our society to meet the definition you see on your screen than any other society in the world, with the possible exception of a place like Japan now. And because we did that, even though we didn't necessarily have it written like this specifically into our rule of law, it's written in other ways, and it basically amounts to this for many of our interactions in our society. So what propertarianism does is when you expand your definition of property to be full and complete, and then you have this moral law, this universal moral law written into your rule of law, combined with a full definition of property, you give your system of rule of law the power to nip all parasitism in the bud. Anybody that tries to do something and have an interaction or a transaction with somebody else that violates this definition, whoever is the victim of that parasitism can go into court and say, look at this definition, what this person is doing, what this group is doing is violating this definition, and it is parasitism upon my property, and they should not be allowed to do it. So again, this is an empirically observed definition. If you watch human interactions, you will see that anytime somebody does something to somebody else that does not meet the definition you see on your screen, people get pissed. The person or group who's on the other end of it gets pissed. Why do they get pissed? Because they perceive that something that they value is being taken from them. It's not voluntary. It's not fully informed. You can go down the line there. And I'm not going to go into this whole definition in specifics right now. I'm going to save that for another video. But you can see, even if you look at the first one there, voluntary. That's a really simple one. What the left and the elites are trying to do is they're trying to take away from us things that we value. We've invested in the quality of our nation. Our ancestors have invested in it. We don't want you doing these things because it tears down the value of the various assets in our nation that we've spent a long time building up, that we still today invest a lot in having as strong as possible. And you are taking this from us involuntarily. If you have a voluntary transaction, that's a market. I walk into a restaurant, I buy some food, I give them my money, they give me the food, we're both happy. It's a voluntary transfer. Involuntary transfers are parasitism. You can look at the next one, fully informed. For example, one time my wife and I bought a mattress from this store. We were new in town. We were just in a hurry. We went to one of the first mattress stores we saw. We went in, we laid down on it. We thought it was comfortable. It was a brand name. We bought it. It was delivered to our house. We put the sheets on it. We laid on it. Very shortly thereafter, we started realizing that the thing was sagging. It was not high quality. We're going, what is the problem here? This is a well-known brand name. We look at the tag. It's not the brand name. There's no brand name tag on it anywhere. So they sold us a brand name mattress and delivered something that wasn't a brand name. We were not fully informed about what we were getting. So we got pissed, of course, because when people experience not fully informed transactions from somebody else, they get mad because they're not getting what they were told they would get. They were not fully informed about what they were getting. And it turned out that this place was owned by an immigrant from a nation with a very low trust culture. And this is, again, one of these costs that we have not known how to capture. But if you're going to bring millions of people in from low trust cultures to a high trust culture like Western civilization, that is theft. So I'm not going to go into the whole definition here, as I said, but you can see if you start looking at this definition, you realize it's not really rocket science. It's just common sense, fairness, and honesty. But it's very important to have it defined specifically like this in our rule of law, because if we don't have that, and if you don't combine it with a full definition of property, there's a lot of transactions happening in your society where people don't have recourse when they get screwed over. Now, of course, in the mattress example, if I would have wanted to sue, if I would have thought it was worth it, I could have had recourse probably. But there's a lot of interactions, as I've been explaining, in our society that are not captured. So you have to have a full definition of property combined with a very specific moral law that human beings universally live by to stop the parasitism when people attempt it. Now, there's one other thing I need to explain about this natural law of reciprocity, or the anti-parasitism principle. We could also call it the silver rule. Do not do unto others as you would not have done unto you. I need to explain something else about the incredible power of this. In every human interaction, we have three choices. When I'm interacting with others, or when a group is interacting with others, there are always three choices and only three choices. You can either fight with the other party, and the two ways you can fight are you can fight outside of court with violence or with slashing their tires or whatever you come up with, or you can fight in a courtroom within the legal system. Your second choice is you can not interact at all with the other party. You can just leave each other alone. And the third choice is you can cooperate. You can trade with each other. You can offer something of value and they can give you something in return that you value. When there's cooperation, when there's trade, we call that a market. Now, look at this list of three choices here with our A and our B for the first choice. And tell me, which of these choices do you want the people of your nation operating in the most? And which do you want them operating in the least? Well, obviously, we want people not operating in 1A. We don't want that kind of conflict, problems, corruption, parasitism. What you want your people operating in the most is number 3. You want people cooperating, because then you have prosperity, you have value-add transactions, and you have peace. So when your rule of law, catch this now, when it pushes the people of your nation down out of 1A and into 1B, what you're doing is you're shifting all sorts of activity down into number 2 and number 3. And people are forced to stop being parasites because your rule of law makes it so they can't engage in parasitism. Because people who are victims of parasitism attempts have legal recourse. So they go to court and they get 1B going. So this forces the parasites down into number 2 and number 3. And when you force people down into number 2 and number 3, they usually go to number 3 because you can't just not interact with other people, because then you have no way of making a living. So you go to number 3 and you end up spending your time and your energy and your expertise and your talent figuring out how to add genuine value to your fellow citizens. And what happens when you do that is everybody gets rich, relatively speaking, compared to societies that do not do this as well. Because your transaction costs go down drastically because you're not having to defend against parasitism by yourself anymore. You have the rule of law, the court, helping you with that. And most people figure out, I don't want to go to court. This is a waste of my time. I'm just going to figure out a way to add genuine value to my fellow citizens. And bam, people figure out how to do that and they get rich. You unleash the positive potential of your population when you do this. So what I want you to see about this rule, this natural law of reciprocity, this anti-parasitism principle, what I want you to see about that is that it is a universal moral law that everyone can agree with, because it is the means of pushing people's activities down out of 1A to number 3. It stops your nation from being in a poverty corruption spiral and moves it into a value-add wealth spiral. The extent to which your civilization does this is the extent to which your civilization becomes wealthy and experiences a high quality of life. So the reason this anti-parasitism principle, this natural law of reciprocity, and when I say natural law, be careful because the term natural law has been used in the past in somewhat different ways. So that's why we don't just call it natural law, because we want to be very clear about what we're saying. But when we put this in place, we are literally forcing people to be moral. We are forcing them not to steal. We are outlawing theft. We are outlawing parasitism. We are punishing evil. And we're forcing people to operate in morality and truth toward each other. So that's our second improvement in rule of law, is having this specifically written out. And this is the rule that decides who's being parasitic against who. And of course, as we all know, what the parasitic elites do and what the left does is not going to pass this test. So we have scientific rule of law here. This is not arbitrary rule of law. This is rule of law that accurately and empirically captures the full scope of human conflicts in a society in a way that our rule of law has not done before. And then it accurately and empirically delivers judgments that are fair and just and moral, not according to the whim of a belief system or an ideology or an arbitrary set of rules, but according to a rule with very specific definitions that are derived from empirical observation. Now, where we went wrong in Western civilization, catch this because this is really important. Where we went wrong is we allowed legislation, in other words, arbitrary rules and activities and laws that violate natural law. We allowed parasitism when we did that. We allowed whoever could get enough votes or buy enough politicians to commit property violations on whoever happened to lose the election or whoever can't afford to buy the politicians. Proprietarianism does not allow any legislation that violates the natural law or the common law of reciprocity. And this brings me to the key governmental design feature of proprietarianism that kills politicians' ability to be corrupt and kills the ability of whoever, corporations or special interest groups or whoever, to buy politicians and use them for their own purposes without regard for the impacts on anybody else. And this is the feature. You could have various government structure underneath. You could have 3 houses of government like we did in the old days in Europe. You could have 2 houses of government. But the key feature is this. This is the fail-safe feature. Any legislation that is passed by the houses of government or by whatever your government structure is, any legislation must be approved by the judiciary to ensure that it does not violate reciprocity, to ensure that it does not violate this non-parasitism principle, to ensure that it is not parasitic on any individual or group in the nation, including individuals or groups that are not party to or even mentioned in the legislation. Make sure that there are no quote-unquote negative externalities, negative domino effects on somebody else. You might say, oh my gosh, if we did that, it would be really hard to pass a lot of legislation. Exactly. Any legislation that was passed would have to be voluntary, fully informed, warranted. It would have to fit this definition, which means groups within the nation can't be parasitic on each other. And if they can't be parasitic on each other, what do they have to do? They have to trade with each other, or else you can't do it. It nips parasitism through the mechanism of government in the bud. Extremely simple, but extremely powerful. Kurt Doolittle calls this market government, forcing groups within a nation to trade with each other. And if your group is all take and no give, you can't operate. If you're a leftist group or a parasitic elite scam, if you just want to take, you simply cannot operate. This forces a market and it eliminates theft via government. Let me give you a quick example. Let's say even in our government today, the Democrats come up with some kind of a welfare scheme that greatly expands welfare. They want to pass something that's even similar to our current welfare program. Well, they're just not going to be able to do it because the judiciary is not going to let them. Look at the definition. Look at the anti-parasitism principle. First of all, it's not voluntary. It's involuntary theft from people who don't want to take their hard-earned money and give it to some welfare queen who's going to raise 4 kids without a father in the home, most of whom are going to have an IQ in the 80s. This is just not an investment that many of us are going to want to make. So they can't do it because it's involuntary. It doesn't meet the voluntary criteria. Now, if you change the legislation to where you have a checkbox on a tax form and it says, I would like to donate fill in the blank amount of dollars to such and such program to help the poor and needy in our nation, and then here's a link to where you can find out how the money will be used. Okay, that's different. Now it becomes voluntary. So then you go on down the line of the anti-parasitism principle. You get down to the bottom. Free of negative externality. There can't be any negative effects on the nation. There can't be any negative effects on any group within the nation. So then you run into other problems. This could still artificially boost the birth rate of lower IQ people in our society, because obviously not everyone that would be on welfare is low IQ, but in general it's the lower IQ people. So this is not good for our society. So you'd have to tweak the legislation further if you wanted it to get passed. You could put in some rules. If you commit a crime, you cannot receive welfare. If you don't have a father in the home, if you don't have 2 married parents in the home, you cannot receive any kind of welfare financial help. If you have more than 2 kids or more than 1 kid, you can't receive any more financial help. You can put in some rules to make sure that there are no negative externalities. You're making sure that you're not having a negative effect on your nation. So you see how this works. The other thing I'll quickly point out is, and it's important to understand, the United States of America is an empire, even within our own borders. And historically, we see that it's very hard to rule over an empire. It's very hard to rule effectively over lots of different groups of people that want lots of different things and want to live lots of different ways. It's just very, very hard. So one of the phrases you'll hear Kurt say is, let 1,000 nations bloom. Let smaller either nations or smaller regions or states within a nation bloom and have their own way of doing things, and it's much easier to rule over more homogeneous groups of people. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't have a United States of America after some kind of a reset, right? We could, but if that's the case, we would absolutely have to have something like this in place to make sure that these parasitic groups can't be parasitic. Because what we've got now is a full franchise democracy, a monopoly democracy where whoever wins the elections gets to impose their will on whoever else. And the problem we grassroots right-wingers have is that we are outnumbered. We are a minority group on this planet. We are a minority instinct. Most people do not want to live like us based on our own merits. They want to get ahead by hook or by crook, however they can. They will gladly be parasitic if you let them. We are simply outnumbered by that type of person. So a democracy, full franchise democracy, where they can impose their will on us through elections does not work for us. I'm not saying you can't have representation. I'm not saying you can't have voting on things, but you have to have a fail-safe like this that does not allow them to pass parasitic legislation. Now, before I move on from this, there's one other thing I need to say. Smart people, when they hear this, immediately they say, okay, wait, you're giving more power to the judiciary. So now what if the left or the elites go and corrupt the judiciary heavily? So that is a valid point, and I'm not going to brush that aside. I'm just going to say there are things that can be done to defend against the judiciary getting majorly corrupted or co-opted, and I have to point this out as well. The very fact that now the left and the elites would be reduced to having to corrupt the judiciary in order to get their way tells you that this is a massive improvement over what we have now. Because right now, the parasitic elites and the left have three options. They can win elections with parasites and politicians just promising free stuff to people. Number two, they can buy politicians to pass parasitic legislation. And number three, politicize the judiciary. And so I'm not belittling that. That is a problem. But what they're really using the most and the most successfully is buying the politicians and just overwhelming us with left instinct parasitic voters. In this case, they're doing it just by flooding us with immigrants that are mostly like that. So what proprietarianism does is it shuts down those first two options. You can't buy politicians because it's pointless because they can't pass parasitic legislation anyway. And you can't overwhelm a democracy with high numbers of parasitic instinct voters because they can't pass parasitic legislation anyway, no matter how many people they have. If you can keep your judiciary from being corrupted, and by the way, the judiciary is less prone to being corrupted than a lot of these other institutions that get taken over by leftism, because what leftism does is it's offering these people fake status that they wouldn't otherwise have. And so leftism gives them everything that they have in life. It gives them their sense of importance. It gives them their sense of status. So they're very susceptible to this. Whereas judges are already high status. They're already well paid. So they're less susceptible to what the left has to offer them. And there are other things that can be done to keep the judiciary from being corrupted that I'm not going to go into here. But the point is, you're drastically reducing the options that the left and that the elites have to try to do what they want to do. And now we as the grassroots right just have one front to defend in this battle. We're not fighting a three-front battle at this point. We only have one front to defend. If we can keep the judiciary relatively clean, we are going to have a massive, massive upgrade over the system we have right now, which allows the parasites to swarm all over us. So we'll talk more about that in the future as well. Let's go to the third improvement in rule of law. Another thing that the left and the parasitic elites do is they lie in public all the time. They lie by omission. They lie by commission. For example, at this very moment, America is headed for civil war because of one simple lie: that white people are uniquely evil in history, and that still to this day we are holding back non-white people from succeeding by mistreating them, and therefore white people are morally obligated to give various forms of property and various things that we value to non-white people in perpetuity. That lie is leading us to civil war. They are using this lie over and over and over again in various ways, shapes, and forms in the public sphere, and they are whipping up a political movement. They import non-white people and they whip them up with this identity politics, anti-white sentiment, and it is driving America into civil war because they can lie with impunity. If they were forced to even give a few additional facts, if they were forced to say, well, we also have to admit that black people have 2/3, 3/4 of their kids born out of wedlock and growing up without a father in the home, and that is a major source of problems in the black community. If they were forced to say, yes, white people had slaves, but white people also came up with the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Technological Revolution, most of the medical technology that doubled the lifespans of billions of people worldwide. If they were forced to just add these types of things to their statements so that they're not lying by omission, it would be much more difficult for them to whip up political movements based on these lies. The problem is public figures can lie with impunity. They have no skin in the game. Proprietarianism fixes that. How? Very simply. Public figures can be taken to court and sued by any member of the public for saying things that are blatantly false that cause any kind of harm whatsoever to any form of property that we value. And it is not a randomly chosen criteria for what people can say and what they can't say. Again, it is very specifically, very thoroughly, very empirically and scientifically written down tests that public speakers have to pass when they speak. They don't have to prove that everything they say is true, because that's very difficult to do. They just have to be able to demonstrate in court that they did due diligence on what they're saying so that they're not blatantly lying. Everything they say has to pass several falsehood tests. And you see them on your screen there. Some of the terminology might not be immediately understandable to you, but I'm going to break this down in a future video. The important thing for you to understand is this is not some random person or a small group of people deciding what can be said and what can not be said. Like the politically correct people are trying to do. They have a set of rules that they've just chosen arbitrarily about what can be said and what cannot be said. And if you violate those rules, they punish you. Well, this is our version of this, but it's not arbitrary. It's based on empirical, scientific definitions of what constitutes truthful statements and what does not. And anybody who looks at this and understands it would have a very hard time arguing that this doesn't constitute a good test for truthful speech. And when I say truthful, I don't mean you've proven that it's true. I mean that you've demonstrated that you've done due diligence, that you're not blatantly speaking falsehood. So propertarianism calls this testimonialism. If you think about, you go to court, right? Maybe you're a witness to a crime or an alleged crime. You sit up on the stand, you give your testimony. If you lie in that situation, you go to jail. You're not allowed to lie in the witness stand or you will be punished. Why? Because lives are at stake. Property is at stake. Now, when public figures stand up and speak in the public sphere, are lives at stake? Are various forms of property at stake? Absolutely. So why would we let public figures lie with impunity when we don't let people do that on a witness stand? Can you imagine if our system of law allowed people to lie on the witness stand in a courtroom and did not punish them for it? We would literally have no civilization. It would be the Wild West. So why should we allow our public figures to stand up and lie with impunity? Because just as much or more is at stake when they're speaking. So what this does is it basically forces public figures to use the scientific method on their speech before they speak. And you say, wow, we'd have a lot more lawsuits, we'd have a lot bigger court system. Yes, exactly. A lot of people tend to think of more lawyers, more court cases as a bad thing, but they don't realize that this is the secret of Western civilization, is bringing all this stuff into the court system so regular people have recourse, and it's not just whoever happens to be the most powerful in the moment can steamroll everybody else. And to be clear, I'm not talking about you sitting around your dinner table and what you say there. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about public speech. So with this in place, it's virtually impossible for leftists to whip up leftist political movements, because in order to whip up their leftist political movements, they have to lie to people about humanity. They have to say everybody's equal, which is a lie, obviously. They have to say white people are uniquely evil, which is a lie. They have to say all the problems of non-white people are white people's fault, which is obviously demonstrably a lie. What the whole leftist diarrhea of the mouth in the public sphere, what all their public speech amounts to, is just telling people who want to be parasites over and over and over again in different ways, somebody else owes you something because lie A and lie B and lie C. And we're going to form a team and go demand that they give us their stuff, and we're going to gain political power, and we're going to get what they owe us by hook or by crook. So I can tell you for sure, my fellow right-wingers, when these people speak their lies and whip up their political movements based on those lies, your property and everything you value is absolutely at stake. They're after your stuff. They're after your money. They're after your values and your ability to live out your values. They're after your ability to raise your kids the way you see fit. They're after your ability to send your kids to a school that your tax dollars are paying for, where they won't be indoctrinated with ridiculous leftist nonsense. They're after your opportunities. They're after your jobs. They're after your university spots. They're after whatever amount of power you happen to have. They're after your reputation. They're after your land. They are after your monuments. They are after your ability to honor and respect your forefathers and your history. They are after your ability to defend yourself and your family with a firearm. They are after your ability to live in some kind of remotely affordable neighborhood that has a low crime rate and is a safe place for you to raise your family. They are after anything and everything that they think that they can take from you. And the first thing that they do when they come after all these things that you value is they speak lies. Lies that their people want to hear. because their people want your stuff and they want to force their silly, false beliefs about humanity down your throat. And if you resist, they intend to punish you to the fullest extent that they can get away with. So I have a simple question for you. Are we going to allow them to speak these lies to come after that which we value, or are we not going to allow them to do that? If you say, yes, I'm going to allow them to speak those lies, then you cannot complain when they use lies to come after that which you value. You can't complain about fake news and leftist political movements and elites lying to cover up their parasitic scams. You can't complain about any of that if you won't take measures to stop it. Now, if you say, yes, I want a solution that stops these public figures from using lies to come after everything I value, then proprietarianism supplies the solution. Some people might say, is this a limit on free speech, or what exactly is this? Well, it's not 100% free speech, it's free truthful speech. And again, the definition of truthful is not you have to prove that it's 100% true, you just have to prove that you have done due diligence, that you're not telling an obvious or blatant lie. That's the solution. So, for example, Barack Obama stood up when he was president and he said, police officers are targeting young black men. So you can see already there's huge problems with this statement. A big one that I'll point out is he's lying by omission. One of the tests that has to be passed by public figures when they speak under proprietarianism is you cannot lie blatantly by omission, by leaving out important information. So what Obama was doing is what the entire left does, which is they say white cops are targeting these young black men because they look at individual instances of times when interactions go bad, or they look at statistics and they say cops and the white cops, they're targeting these young black men, but they're leaving out the inconvenient little fact that doesn't fit their narrative that young black men are what, 3, maybe 5% of the population, and they commit almost half the violent crime in America. So the cops are dealing with these young black men far more in a statistically outsized way. So you would expect the percentage of interactions that go bad to also be statistically outsized. But they don't mention that. So Barack Obama stands up, he says this, he lies by omission, he doesn't mention that aspect of the reality of the situation, and a black guy grabs a rifle and shoots police officers in cold blood and kills them on the streets of Dallas, Texas. Under proprietarianism, the families of those police officers, and very possibly other people as well, could sue Barack Obama and ruin him. And rightly so. So it's free, truthful speech. And you say, well, I don't know, I'm a free speech absolutist. No, you're not. You don't allow people to make threats against the president. Our laws today don't allow that. We don't even allow people to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. You walk into a movie theater and you yell fire, you're going to go to jail. You don't have free speech in that situation. Why? Because you're imposing a cost on people. Did Barack Obama impose a cost on people when he said that? Absolutely. Are you going to let him say that? If you're going to let him say that, then don't complain about the results of it. So free speech sounds good, but it leaves a huge door open to our enemies to tell lies that make parasites feel good and cause all sorts of problems for us. And you have to understand that one of the biggest advantages of Western civilization that has allowed us to succeed so greatly is truth. And if you allow lies to bury the truth, see, the problem with lies is a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth even gets its pants on. It's much easier to just lie. It's much harder. It's much more time consuming. It's much more expensive, so to speak, in various ways to correct lies with the truth. So what this solution does is it makes the public figures do this due diligence and do this work before they speak, instead of making us go out there behind the curve and try to correct all their lies, because it's too much work. We can't do it. Plus, the lies that they tell appeal to people because it makes them feel good. So if you don't want to implement this solution, and we'll talk about it in later videos, what other option do you recommend to stop their lying and the results of their lying? Even if you can destroy CNN, another company is going to crop up because there's a market for lies. The only way to shut it down is shut it down at the source, the people who would come out and speak those lies, and force them to have skin in the game. Allow people recourse in court to punish people who pollute the informational commons in the same way that people have recourse in court to punish a car company if they put out a bunch of cars with faulty brakes that start breaking down 2 weeks after the car is purchased and killing people. You can't produce a faulty product in America like that without getting punished for it, without getting sued for it. And the system is good enough to where Chevy says, yeah, we could make a little bit more money by having these cheaper brakes, but we're going to lose it all in the end because we're going to get sued. So let's just make good brakes in the first place. So you force public speakers to go through that same thinking process. It's not worth it for them to have their life ruined by going out there and lying. And yes, there will be a lot more court cases, but eventually what will happen is we will have glorious relative silence on the airwaves. Instead of having to put up with this constant leftist narrative of lie after lie, whipping people up against us and against everything we value. So we already have limitations on free speech. We don't let people yell fire in a crowded theater. We don't let people lie on the witness stand. Do you have 100% free speech on the witness stand in a courtroom? No, you do not, and you should not. If you lie, you will get punished. Does a scientist have 100% free speech when they put out a scientific research paper? Well, in a sense they do, because they can produce false data if they want. They can invent false data and put it out, but if they get caught, their reputation is ruined. So in a sense, there is a mechanism in place, at least of sorts, in the scientific community to where people who are blatantly false get punished. And of course, that's a whole nother realm because political correctness has really affected the scientific community in many ways. But you see my point. In real science, if you lie, your thing is not going to work. Your product that you're trying to produce is not going to work. You have to operate in truth in the hard sciences. In a courtroom, you have to operate in truth or you don't even have a civilization. What propertarianism does is it extends civilization outside of a courtroom, outside of the hard sciences, into the realm of social interactions by taking science from those other realms and extending it into this realm, forcing public figures to use the scientific method on their speech. If you're sitting there thinking, man, this is pretty drastic, and man, it is powerful. Yes, correct. It is a fantastic solution for right-wingers because our strength is operating in the truth. We want to compete honestly on merit, and we know that if we force everybody in a group to do that, we're going to unleash the positive potential of that group. It's all these people that don't want to do that that are the problem. And the first thing they do to try to be a parasite is to lie. You nip it in the bud with testimonialism. You know, everybody always says, we need to keep the politicians and the media accountable. Well, how exactly? Do they care that you go on your Facebook and say how stupid CNN is? Does CNN care? No, they don't care. But if they get sued, they'll care. People say, there's got to be something we can do about this. Well, there is something we can do. I just explained it to you. This keeps them accountable. So that's the big picture overview of propertarianism. I just explained 3 key improvements in rule of law, a key feature of governmental design that reduces our parasitic enemies' options from 3 options to only 1 option. And the last thing I'll mention is that propertarianism also recommends, as part of the governance of a nation, having a militia. This is what I call team defense against parasitism. To give you a little bit of a picture, you might think of the original intent of the founding fathers, for example. Or in the modern world, Switzerland, which is one of the best run countries in the world, where every adult man is required to own a firearm, that type of idea. So I just want to get the idea in your head of a militia, because this is also an important concept in propertarianism, the concept of sovereignty. Meaning people can't come take your stuff. You have control over your stuff. But the thing is, you're not strong enough by yourself to defend all your stuff. So you have to have a team of people that you are a part of, that together you defend each other's stuff. If somebody comes after your stuff, I will come and defend you. If somebody comes after my stuff, you will come help defend me. And we have a team of people that defends against parasitism. Nobody gets a free ride. Nobody gets to just benefit from other people's defense of their property without actively participating in defending each other's property from encroachments and parasitism. So you'll hear Kurt and other propertarians use the term sovereignty, ownership of gains, effective defense of our various assets and property rights. And this would be something that every adult male in the society would be required to participate in, because if not, guess what? You're a free rider. You're a parasite. So I'm not going to go into detail here. We can get into it in future videos, but I just want you to be aware of this aspect because it's also part of our defense against the judiciary being corrupted or co-opted by the left or by the elites. You build in several layers of defense against our enemies. In closing, what you can see here is that these 3 improvements in rule of law, along with the key feature of governmental design that cuts out the government corruption and the ability for the left and the elites to be parasitic, combined with the militia feature of governance, what each of these aspects of propertarianism does is they extend the civilizational best practices of Western civilization and defend them against that which would attack or encroach upon them. And you can see that all this is empirical, scientific. None of it is generated at random or arbitrarily. It's an application of science, and we're just taking the scientific method and extending it out of not just the realm of the hard sciences, but into the social realm, into rule of law. Propertarianism extends and defends the key best practices of Western civilization. So as I close here, just a couple reminders. We're going to be compiling a commonly asked questions, a Q&A, that will be either on my website or the Propertarianism website or both, and we'll expand on it over time because we really want people to understand it and help people picture how it works. And again, I'm going to be coming out with more videos on this. Remember, there are links in the description that will take you to good starting places if you want to look into propertarianism further, that will point you in the right direction. And if you're excited about this like I am, if you say, wow, this is really a great solution, people need to hear about this, spread the word. Spread this video around. We're just starting right now to popularize this. And it's going to be big. This is going to go big because it is a fantastic solution for the long term for the right wing. It's a huge upgrade over what we have now. So if you want more help spreading it, I have a link in the description to a repository of propertarian memes. Some of them are simple and fun. Some of them are more meaty quotes and definitions from propertarianism. But you can go there and download memes that you can use to spread around and just get people interested in propertarianism and help spread the word that way. That's all I've got for this video. All the best. I love you all. Till next time. How much longer do we want to play trench warfare with the left? How many more times are we going to have to fight this battle? You know what my answer is? 0. 0 more times. This is going to be the last time. And if that doesn't get you excited, I don't know what will.